Many commentators argue that the United States' many security alliances create a significant source of global power for the U.S. Commentators often compare China unfavorably to the United States, saying it lacks this kind of influence. But Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Isaac Kardon, who together have co-authored several publications on this topic, argue that China has adopted a different approach. It's an internal security provider for many countries. Today on Scouted, we'll talk with these scholars and we'll talk about how China does this and what are the implications for Chinese power and influence around the world, for the spread of democracy, and for international order. I'm Jennifer Lind. I'm the editor of Blue Blaze. And in this episode, I am very excited to be hosting Professor Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Dr. Isaac Kardon. Isaac is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Sheena hails from UT Austin, and she is also the editor of the terrific publication Texas National Security Review. And they're both prominent China experts and leading voices in the conversation today about U.S.-China relations. So Isaac and Sheena, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's exciting to be on your podcast. First one.
Very first one. Very excited. So recently, the two of you have worked together to produce a series of publications on a really fascinating theme, the theme of China as an internal security provider. And I found this really prescient and really interesting. When your IS article came out, I immediately put it on my syllabus for my China course, and the students really, really enjoyed it. There's this view out there among a lot of foreign policy experts that China lacks traditional security alliances, and this is a source of comparative weakness compared to the United States. But you guys offer a very different view. So can you tell us more about this? Namely, what does China do to help countries with their internal security problems? And who are those countries? Sheena, maybe you want to start us off?
Sure. This was something that Isaac and I were each looking at in respective areas of our research. Isaac's terrific work on China's global port presence, and some work that I was doing looking at police outreach and the role of China's domestic security agencies internally as it related to China's internal security policies. Each of us noticed that China increasingly was providing security to a much broader range of countries and partners than we had expected to find. But that form of security assistance that China was providing didn't really look like U.S. alliances and partnerships and wasn't really focused on the military, even the PLA. The PLA does do military diplomacy, but China's got a much broader range of tools that it uses to engage in security outreach, in security diplomacy, in security training and assistance. So we were really interested in and started talking about some of the cases where you could see that were pretty surprising to us, including cases like Hungary, which has an alliance with NATO, but also signed a security agreement with China, or Vietnam, where there's a lot of overlap in security cooperation and security assistance with both the US and China. And that seemed really different than the Cold War. We wanted to really investigate why this was happening and what the implications were for world politics.
Conceptually, we wanted to differentiate between these traditional military-led, alliance-oriented type security cooperative arrangements that the U.S. has, and not get into the mode of mirror imaging that's the relevant category to measure on the Chinese side. And as far as we can tell, there's not really any systematic analysis in the public record or that the U.S. government does, and we'll get to some of this, on this, what we believe to be more prominent element of China's view of what international security ought to be like, and in particular this idea about regime security being the primary and perhaps even dominant set of requirements for lots of states in the world.
And Xi Jinping, when he came into office, shortly after he became China's preeminent leader, developed what he calls this comprehensive national security concept, which really at its core very explicitly says the foundation of national security is political security. And political security is the security of the socialist system of China, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and its central committee, and Xi Jinping at the core of that leadership. And so it really is China's concept of national security puts regime security as the foundational thing that has to be protected. And so that's where China starts.
What exactly is China doing for these internal security partners? What are some of the tools that it's using? You note that the actors are very different than the normal security actors, such as the United States. Frequently, it's the Department of Defense, it's the Air Force, it's the intelligence agencies, and so on, that are part of this external security infrastructure. So talk us through, on the Chinese side, what does this look like?
The tools that China thinks of when it thinks about guaranteeing regime security, the actors that you mentioned that are primarily engaged in that are not just the military, although the military obviously has a huge role in that, but it's also the internal security apparatus. So in China, that's the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, and a party body called the Central Political Legal Commission that sits over China's ministries of justice, the court system, the ministries of public and state security, and coordinates all of them for the purpose of protecting regime security. Those actors, starting, around the time toward the end of Xi Jinping's first term, beginning of his second, really started to adopt a much more global view of their role. And so we started to see more and more cases of those actors meeting with foreign counterparts, offering training to foreign police forces or foreign counterparts in other countries.
Just to add further on this original question about the personnel involved in which ministries, this is also relevant in terms of the counterparts on the other side. And this gets back to the point about if we're just looking at the people that we engage with doing the types of activities that we do, we're misunderstanding this fundamentally. I think Vietnam is the clearest illustration of this case. China's national security, comprehensive national security concept centered on political security, focused on the stability of the political party in power, is actually a very widely shared number one threat perception. Authoritarian states are interested in and tend to uptake better this type of discourse and these types of norms and practices and technologies, which you can get into, that support internal security. Unlike the US system, which is here's a model for regional security and here's what we do, here's what we sell, come participate and cooperate in this regional security. Here we see a much more bilateralized process.
You mentioned earlier the Cold War and the sort of pattern of superpower relations, superpower patronage with smaller countries. Has China innovated something here? How does this differ from the previous superpower rivalry, in other words? Sheena?
So this is a really interesting question, and I think it's one of the questions that potentially has the biggest and longest lasting strategic implications for how we think about the world as we're living in it now. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union more or less provided both internal and external security support to their client states. The United States called this foreign internal defense for a good chunk of the Cold War and provided a lot of assistance very explicitly aimed per national security, presidential memoranda and things at shoring up governments against potential communist subversion. And so that spanned the internal to external security spectrum. And the Soviet Union largely did the same with its client states. And so you didn't have what we're seeing today, which is a lot of third countries where the United States provides external security and China is stepping in to provide domestic security assistance. We called this concept in the piece that we wrote for international security, we called this concept security hybridization, where you're really getting security being provided in this hybridized, overlapping fashion by two different security providers. The United States largely took itself out of the internal security game, partly based on some things it found were and weren't effective during the Cold War, and partly because it seemed less necessary in this moment of sort of the end of history, transition toward democracy. So the United States doesn't really provide the kind of internal security assistance that China does. China as a sort of late military modernizer, is still building up its own military capacity, and it's doing some export and some provision of external security capacity. We don't want to downplay what it's doing in that space. But each of the two great powers has different comparative advantages in the type of security that they can provide. And so that opens this space for countries to engage in what former CIA Director Bill Burns called these non-monogamous security relationships, where countries can basically have relationships with both great powers and extract the maximum beneficial security assistance from both. But that overlaps really uncharted territory. We know from just basic comparative politics that if you have two rival security forces in an autocracy, for example, that kind of counterbalancing can lead to political instability. It can heighten coup risk under certain political conditions. We don't really have a good empirical baseline for understanding how having two great powers providing security to different parts of the security apparatus, like is happening in Vietnam today, what the implications for either stability in that country, that recipient country, or sort of patterns of global or regional stability are going to be.
There's potential for this to be a source of internal instability in Vietnam for sure, and that would certainly threaten the possibility of having a hybrid security relationship there. You have a Vietnamese Communist Party and state apparatus that have these contradictory views about what their relationship needs to be with China and the United States. But what we saw recently is that Chinese army and Vietnamese army forces were exercising for the first time ever. And this is happening in parallel with the US over the last several years, really dramatically changing the nature of its particularly naval engagements and its carrier visits and its overall defense relationship with presumably another part of the Vietnamese military. The army is much more party affiliated in this system as it is in the Chinese system in a lot of ways. Less technically proficient, less cosmopolitan and liberalized and educated, more focused on things like political and regime security.
But yes, this may not be a particularly stable equilibrium in the recipient countries where it's taking place, right? And that in and of itself is going to be really important to know for the United States as an actor with global presence, with military forces that might be deployed in a place where China is providing police training, surveillance technology, security equipment to a different part of that country's security apparatus. If I was a local commander of any part of the US military, that's something I would want to be aware of and factor into what I was thinking about. So there is that risk of just overall political instability, of the instability, localized instability in geopolitical competition.
So this is a really new area. You guys have just kind of discovered this and you're starting to study this. So maybe we're just speculating, but I'm wondering if the notion of hybridization has a expiration date, right? Like if the rivalry between China and the US intensifies, that at some point they will say to the Vietnams and to the Hungarys, particularly to a treaty ally, right? They will say, hey, I know you don't want to have to choose, but you're going to have to choose because the rivalry has really heated up to this extent. What do you think of that?
So we are very sensitive to this possibility that hybridization is sort of a passing phenomenon, or that it's unstable or is historically contingent on this kind of post-Cold War period. But I think there's at least some evidence already out there that this is maybe a characteristic of the emerging international security environment overall, where it's not just the US and China, and there's actually quite a lot of hybridization in a lot of security realms. And there are a couple reasons that I think that. One is that the US has certainly tried to promote some sort of exclusivity in its security relationships. There's no doubt that the United States has tried to oppose Chinese efforts to develop bases overseas, and they've objected quite explicitly to many instances of Chinese security access or cooperation with a foreign country as being over the line. The UAE is the case that really stands out. To me, there was a major F-35 sale to the Emiratis on the line. The United States didn't like that they were installing Huawei systems that could potentially do electronic surveillance and interference with U.S. systems. They didn't like that maybe the PLA was building a signals intelligence base or a naval base in Abu Dhabi, and demanded that they choose. And it seems as though the Emiratis decided just not to choose and just push the question off. People could interpret the facts differently, and maybe the Emirates has gone a lot further over to China than we're properly pricing in. But my read on that is they want to continue to have a useful security relationship with the United States and China, and at least in that case, it appears relatively stable. I'm curious what Sheena thinks about whether hybridization is here to stay.
I think we'll see some efforts on each great power's part to try to get countries to make a choice. Here's the problem that each of them is going to confront, and that's that they don't have the same comparative advantages in the other type of security. So depending on what that third country needs, it's hard for the United States, for example, to go to Vietnam and say, hey, we will provide defense cooperation and we'll guarantee the internal security of the Vietnamese Communist Party, right? Like, that's not what the United States thinks of its security cooperation or security assistance does. It's not what the United States has historically been good at. And there are real moral, ethical, and even legal issues that constrain the United States' ability and desire to provide a full spectrum of security assistance. And so for a number of countries whose leaders perceive both sets of security assistance as being helpful to their goals, the United States is going to face a challenge where it is going to be difficult to force a choice, because neither country is willing or able to provide the kind of security that's coming from the other great power.
You mentioned in your Carnegie report that China is doing these internal security activities alongside a global security agenda. And so can you tell us about this Chinese global security initiative? You refer to it as externalizing a national security concept that's been primarily focused on regime security and non-traditional security threats. So what is the Global Security Initiative?
The Global Security Initiative is something that Xi Jinping announced in April of 2022. And frankly, I think we were slow to catch on to what the Global Security Initiative was about for a couple of different reasons. One was that in April of 2022, all eyes were fixed on Ukraine. But as, a couple of years of data have accumulated, we're starting to see that the Global Security Initiative really is an effort, I think, and I think we have present evidence in the report to show that it is an effort to significantly revise global security governance around the way that China thinks about global security and what security is, who it's for, and what it believes the rest of the world will buy into in terms of changing the nature of global security architecture. So I think it's really important to understand that it is explicitly there to promote the regime security of China's socialist party-led system. That is one of the major goals. To do that, China sees real gaps in global security governance, particularly around internal security and emerging non-traditional security challenges that aren't very well addressed by an F-35, and that are more about joint police patrols and border smuggling or cyber scams and things like that. What the report does is really document both what China has diagnosed as the gaps and the problems in global security governance, and what it's offered as solutions, which it's done at the global level, at the regional level, and in a bunch of its bilateral relationships. China has created this forum, the Global Public Security Cooperation Forum, which used to be called the Lianyungang Forum, and it is a forum for global law enforcement cooperation. It is now actually China's the largest global security gathering hosted by the PRC. It's bigger than the Xiangshan Defense Forum that takes place every year in October. This is really about proposing new norms and standards for global police cooperation, for law enforcement, and for measuring which countries are successful at public security. But again, it is not something that the Pentagon has put a lot of effort into tracking. They're really busy looking at China's military buildup, and that's probably where they should be focused. But the United States interagency has been, I think, slow to realize how much China is driving revision to global security architecture and global security governance, not by going head to head with the US high-end conventional defense capabilities and the alliance structure, but by just going around it, using highly informal means of creating new architecture that's not directly competitive, but over time reduces the centrality of the United States' role as a global security provider. So to get back to Isaac's point, right, we have to avoid this mirror imaging tendency, because we will miss a ton of what China is doing and how much of the rest of the world it is pulling in and getting on board with this alternate way of thinking about and governing security in the international system.
When you were talking, I was thinking about, for example, the Pacific Islands. That's just one example of several countries where you could say the Chinese approach is probably going to be more aimed at the things that directly affect human security, right? As opposed to, oh, should the United States sign an alliance or do port visits and the kinds of things that we often do. And so I think what you're saying is really resonating, certainly for that case, and I'm guessing for many others. When you two study this, do you see this as one way in which China is really significantly building its global influence, and it's one way that the United States maybe hasn't even really been attuned to so far?
An example of where I think you can see this kind of competitive advantage for China and use of a certain set of tools of statecraft, and in particular ways of externalizing some of its national security concerns, is that that their big entree into the region recently were riots in the Solomon Islands that had a lot to do with China's influence and presence in the Solomon Islands to begin with. And so they had a natural ally in the incumbent Sogavare, who was supportive of these ties for some of the reasons that you stated. It offers a security good to an embattled leader that is effectively survival. It's a first order concern. That's not a role that the United States is comfortable playing. I guess I'll defer to those with better historical memories of all the various incidences in the Cold War where we may well have thought we could do that, and probably with some success in certain cases. I don't think that's something that we now have a well-tuned instrument for doing. And as Sheena's mentioned, there are all sorts of ethical problems, setting aside the legal ones, about whether or not you want to commit yourself to supporting leaders who are going to use internal security forces for all sorts of dastardly deeds. That's obviously an advantage that China offers in this space, as it does in economic development. They don't really care what you do with it. They're not going to associate any conditions related to your governance or your human rights or your other domestic practices. And that's not a race to the bottom that I think we should be eager to get in. Sticking to the U.S. guns in this regard is probably where I would start as a strategic proposition, which is that if you want to make states more robust, then you invest in things like aid for their development and governance. So on this regional point, you have states with weak governance for whom a very small investment of Chinese security outreach, and this can come in the form of training, which is one of the areas that we're doing a lot of research. This can come in the form of technology sales, particularly surveillance and software for policing and criminal investigation, things of that nature.
I think one of the reasons why this is such a hard policy problem to think about for the United States or for the international community is that in many cases, China actually is providing some global public security goods. It is better for people in the Pacific Islands if their police and law enforcement are able to provide basic public safety. The ability to provide safety for citizens is a legitimate function of a democratic government. Right? And so China providing that ability to parts of the world where governments haven't been able to provide that is not a bad thing. And it's not going to be perceived as a bad thing by the citizens and the elected officials in many of the countries where China is stepping in to fill what is a real gap. On the other hand, those same tools can be misused, can be used for transnational repression or to strengthen the repressive capacity of a country that undergoes an autocratic reversion and goes from a weak democracy into an autocracy, which we've seen a lot of in global politics in the last decade. And so, these effects aren't neatly separable from each other. But at the same time, the United States isn't going to get anywhere by only highlighting the negative effects, not acknowledging that in some cases China is solving real governance problems in recipient countries, even if they have negative externalities, even if they have these double-edged sword effects on the recipient countries. It is not going to be helpful, especially if the United States and its partners don't have another solution, right? And so that's part of why I think that there's both a need to acknowledge the complex effects that China becoming a security provider is having in the global environment, and there's a real policy implication to that, which is that critiquing without offering a substitute isn't going to be very effective. And we saw that in some of the early sort of pushback on American efforts to go after Huawei technology, right? That the recipient governments were in some cases saying, great, do you have a solution? And if the answer was no, then it's much harder for the United States to have a constructive conversation. But I think it gets at this question of, is the United States out of the game? Well, yes and no. I don't think we've done a good job of realizing how widespread this phenomenon was, but also realizing how much traction it's going to get in parts of the world where there is a form of security that the United States hasn't excelled and the international community haven't excelled at providing. And so I think we need to recognize that China has engaged in some real problem solving there in order to then have a conversation about the potential negative side effects, whether it's on stability or human rights and global freedom.
This is such a rich topic that you've discovered, and could talk about this for hours. But Sheena, Chestnut, Greitens, and Isaac Kardon, congratulations on this really exciting research program. And thank you so much for joining us here at Blue Blaze.
Thanks so much for having us. This was a ton of fun, and look forward to listening to this and all future podcast episodes.
Wonderful.
Really a pleasure. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.